basically this is where beer starts. This is what we call a premium two-row malted barley. Comes from the northern tier of the United States and southern Canada. 80% of any of our recipes use this two-row premium malt.
Smells good.
Yeah, and it's tasty. I mean, you get a little crunch of it. So we take that, we run it through this mill, and this is sort of our standard base two-row, and then we'll mix specialty grains in with it. So
it's really sweet too.
Yeah, it is. And then some of the specialty malts, if you taste this, this is one that's been kilned at a little higher temperature. It's a little crunchier. It's got a little bit more of a sweet, almost a caramely sort of character compared to this one. And it's also a darker color, so when it goes into beer, it's going to give, this particular malt will give a deep reddish color. There's a lot of this in our Laughing Lab. It gives that real deep red color. And you use something like this in a stout or a porter, and this will almost have almost a burnt character. And real friable because it's been roasted so
it's almost like a coffee flavor.
Right. So this is where you get that sort of roasted, real heavy roasted coffee flavor from a stout, from a porter. So the malt really kind of is the basis for the beer, and it gives all the sweetness for the beer, it gives all the color for the beer. So really, the combination of this is the start of any beer recipe. So from the mill room where we were, after the grain is milled, it goes through an auger system on top of the roof, which you can't see, and then it drops into this hopper. So by the time it gets here, the malts have been blended, it's been crushed, and when we crush the grain, what we're trying to do is just break open that husk material, but you don't want to pulverize it into flour because that husk material actually acts as a natural filter bed in this vessel. So if you pulverize it, you don't get a good filter bed. So what happens is at the beginning of the brew, we'll mash in through here, meaning hot water is injected into the flow, goes through this device that mixes the water in the grain and drops it into the mash tun. So the temperatures are real critical at that point, but once you do that, you're basically just setting up a reaction that's going to happen anyway. There's enzymes that are already present in the malt, and they're going to convert the starches to sugars. So we like to brag that we're doing all the work in the brewery, but really what we're doing is setting up reactions that are going to happen anyway. So now we want to extract that sugar out in liquid form. So at that point, it's almost like steeping tea. You've got the liquid in there that you draw off a false bottom, and this husk material sets up this nice natural filter bed. So the first thing you do is you run it back up in on top. So any little particles that get through come back in on top, and once that filter bed sets up, you get a nice clear, we call it wort at that point, but it's a sugary liquid that's going to be beer later on. And so we run that off the bottom, and we pump that into the kettle, which is going to happen in the next step. And at the same time, we're putting more water in on top so that we're slowly filtering water through this grain bed to pick up all that, to extract as much of that sugar as possible and then get it out in the kettle. There's still a lot of great stuff left in the grain. There's still a lot of proteins and a lot of organic material. So what we do now is we'll kick it out this side man-way. There's an auger system that takes it back to a big roll-off dumpster in the back, and it'll all go down to Venatucci Farm, and they'll feed it to chickens, cattle, pigs, and they also use it for an organic soil amendment. So in the kettle, when we come to a boil, we'll dose the hops at that point. Right. This is a sample of the hops. We're doing IPA, so we've got a lot of hops lined up here.
Now, why are these look like, this looks like feed, like cow feed or something, pellets.
Yeah, the hop flour, as they call it, when it comes off the vine, it almost looks like a small pine cone, but very soft. And the reason that we use this format is they take that hop, they pull it out of the fields, and it's real sensitive to oxidation. So once it comes out of the fields, they run it through they call it a little a pelletizing machine. It's almost like a little mill, and all it does is compress it. And the oils, there's natural oils in there that hold it together. So they don't add anything to make it go into this format, but by doing that, they reduce the surface area, and so it lasts longer. You only harvest hops once a year. So you want those hops to have the same characteristic at the beginning of that year and at the end of the year. And the hops give the bittering components to the beer. So you're balancing that malt sweetness and the bittering character from the hops. So any recipe, really, that's one of the balancing acts, is how much malt character, how much hops. We're brewing IPA here, so that balance is way skewed towards hops. I mean, that particular style is all about hops. So there's hops in the beginning of the boil, there's hops in the middle of the boil, there's hops at the end of the boil. and it'll be aged on hops in the fermentation tank for that particular style. Now, Laughing Lab's a Scottish ale. It's a lot maltier, so you wouldn't see nearly as many hops sitting here for that particular beer.
I just ate one of those pellets, and I feel like I just drank the strongest IPA I've ever had.
Yeah, I guess I should have mentioned that it's fun to sample the grain, but the hops not so much.
I want to go back and add some grain, and I feel like I'll be drinking a beer in solid
We generally
form.
just smell the hops. That's generally the way we analyze them. We don't actually eat them. But
so that was wrong what I did.
No, you didn't know any better. So once we boil for 90 minutes. We'll dose the hops throughout that boil. Depending on the beer, we'll do 2 additions or 3 additions or maybe 4 additions of hops. And then it comes out, we inject sterilized air into the flow. And the reason for that is when the yeast hits the wort, the first thing it's going to do is take all the oxygen it can to kind of give it its energy to do its job. And so we'll run from a flexible hose from the brew house into one of these fermentation tanks. So all these tanks with the cones on the bottom are fermentation tanks. And so the yeast will be in the fermentation tank. The wort goes into the fermentation tank at about 70 degrees, 68 to 70 degrees. And the first thing it does, the yeast pulls all the oxygen out of the liquid, and that's basically energizes them. And then after that, the yeast is a single cell organism, and it does what it does, and that's consume the sugars. Mm-hmm. And so the byproduct of that reaction, it consumes the sugars. The byproduct is alcohol and CO2. Each of these tanks are individually temperature controlled, so we can set the fermentation temperature for the particular yeast that we're using. And generally, for most of our ales, that will ferment in about 6 days. And then we'll drop the temperature down. And when we drop the temperature, any yeast that's still in suspension drops to the bottom of the tank and kind of goes dormant. It's done its job, it's eaten well, it's now getting cooled down, and it goes to sleep. So that whole process for ales ends up taking about 2 to 3 weeks for the fermentation and the cold aging process. What we'll do for most of our beers is filter them. We do what we call a coarse filtration because we don't want to suck all the flavor out of it. But people do expect to hold their beer up and have it look pretty. And so that's really what we're doing. We're not, some of the big guys filter it down to the point where there's really no, well, Zima was a good example of how far you can filter beer. You can filter
beer?
it until it has...
Zima? Wait a minute. Zima is beer.
Well, that's the thing. It starts its life as a barley-based fermented beverage. Wow. And they filtered all the character out of it so then they could add whatever the hell they added, lemon, lime, or I don't know what it was.
Wow.
So I'm just saying that you can filter pretty much everything, including all the life and flavor out of it. We don't do that. And at that point, it's finished beer. If we were a brew pub, we could tap directly to these tanks and serve to the bar, but in our case, we run it to packaging. So from these tanks, it'll either go to the bottling line or the keg line. And most people never think about how complicated it is to get beer in a bottle because you're so used to drinking it out of a bottle, but it goes through a series of stages where first stage, it goes through a rinser. There's a mild sanitizing rinse that's sprayed up inside each individual bottle as it rotates around the rinser. That's just to get any packaging dust from the case boxes or anything. They're new bottles, so it's not as if you have to clean them, but you do want to rinse any dust out of them. They set down on the conveyor, they go to the filler, and this is really the heart of the machine because to get beer in a bottle, the first thing you want to do is get all the oxygen out. So the first stage it goes through as it rotates around this machine is there's a vacuum hooked up to it, sucks all the air out. Then it replaces all that air with CO2, and it pressurizes the bottle to about 30 psi so that when you fill the beer against that CO2, it doesn't foam. You can imagine trying to fill 40 bottles a minute out of a tap, a hand tap from a keg, or even a faucet. It would foam like crazy. So you got to have that counter pressure so the beer goes in without foaming like crazy. If everything's working right, which it should be, then you have just the beer just foaming up to the neck of the bottle, and you want that because you don't want any air to get back in there between the filler and the capper. So with that CO2 just coming up, CO2 is heavier than air, so you get no oxygen that comes back in it. And then when the cap goes on it caps on that foam, and you have a nice oxygen-free environment. And then it goes through here, which blows off the water, so you have a decent surface to adhere the labels to. And when it goes through here, it comes around, the glue picks up the label, slaps it on the bottle, runs it around, and goes out there, and it's finished. You could drink it there, but we prefer to put it on pallets and sell it.